everyone. Welcome to the very last session of Winter School 2026. My name is Jack Chen from the University of Virginia. It's my great pleasure today to introduce and chair the session for Dr. Lwando Scott. Dr. Lwando Scott is senior researcher at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape. He is a researcher in a European Union grant realizing girls' and women's inclusion, representation, and empowerment, and editorial board member for Africa Focus Journal, and co-chair of Contemporary History and Humanities Seminar. Dr. Lwando Scott holds his PhD in sociology, and he is an interdisciplinary scholar who focuses on gender and sexualities, how these categories must be linked to ideas of freedom in post-apartheid South Africa. Dr. Scott has been working on developing the concept of queering the post-colony by incorporating and stretching concepts such as sexuality, queerness in particular, gender, and culture within the post-colonial / post-apartheid context. Dr. Scott is interested in expansive ideas and practices of freedom that go beyond normative nationalist and racialized boundaries. His work echoes the call issued by Fahima Raiz in her epic poem, Let Us Create a New Lexicon. And let me just say before I turn things over to Dr. Scott, what a fabulous outfit he is wearing today.
Thank you so much, Jack. God, so many eyes. Yes, it's been an incredibly productive week and last 2 days of last week, which bled into this week. One could do a preamble about this week, but I won't. I will just get into the paper. But there's lots of things in which we can link, and some of which will come through in the paper. Even if I don't point them, you'll be able to see how they come through. Perhaps to start by saying, I think that the Charlotte Matleke and Mary Robinson chair needs to create a Dairy Girls expedition to Ireland, because clearly there are lots of fans of the show here, and I'm open to be the president. Or perhaps we can invite Aunt Sarah to come and speak. Okay, anyway, my talk, in this presentation, I'm wondering what happens when we bring cityness, literariness, and queerness into conversation with each other through an exploration of the queer subject depicted in the novel The Quiet Violence of Dreams by K. Selodeka, which is right here. I'm a sociologist by training, as already been said, and while I brand myself an interdisciplinary scholar, I am an imposter, to use a term, in the literary world. Hence, this work is likely to be incomplete and have holes. I have submitted this piece for publication, but it is yet to come back from the reviewers. And I must confess, Lindo, with this piece particularly, I'm very much guilty of responding to the publish or perish paradigm as I sent it out while I felt it needed more time. But I digress. In this year's winter school, we've had robust conversations, as I've said, and I think that they will serve us as we think about our different projects, and will certainly serve me as I think about mine. Perhaps to thread one point from the week, which Kim has already actually bit me to it in some way, but I also really appreciated Andres, his first point in reference to S. Beckett: try again, fall, fail again, fall better. Failure has been a recurring theme in this winter school, and Andres spoke about failure as of arrival as part of an act of creating. Of course, there was also an engagement of failure when Usinazo spoke about Forterre and the work they are doing there, albeit perhaps from a different register. But she did speak about how failure could possibly be used in productive ways. I wanted to bring Andres's failure through S. Beckett to my own deliberations of failure, which I'm sure you know now is queer failure. Queer failure is a useful tool to think with in a world dominated by ideas and ideals of heteronormative success. The idea of queer failure was popularized by Jack Halberstam in the book The Queer Art of Failure. Other scholars, of course, and artists have picked up on the idea of failure. And one of the recent, which I also really, really enjoy, is Ocean Vyong, who wrote the amazing debut novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. While promoting his books, Vyong spoke about queer failure and about how queer people grow up in a world with no signposts, and so they have to begin to make their own way in the world. They must learn how to be through a series of failures. Here then, failure becomes a way of being in the world. It becomes a teacher. It becomes a way to chart your own path in a pathless world. Why am I nervous now? It becomes an opportunity to discover a way to chart your own path in a pathless world, as I said. And so in this, queer people fail forward, creating, forging, growing, and becoming.
But queer folks, we very rarely have modes. We never have instruction manuals. We don't have the talk, from our parents about the birds and the bees. And so a lot of our way towards desire is also a way towards self-knowledge, both on a psychological level, but on an anatomical level. We learn on the fly. And I wanted to have and honor that tradition of learning through failure. Because I think in this country, we shame failure. When people fail, we cast them aside. But for queer folks, failure becomes a necessary praxis towards success.
I like how his voice is incredibly affected in that, actually. Halberstam's idea of queer failure praises those who are anti-normative, anti-capitalist, and interdisciplinary. And here then, queer people, gender non-conforming beings, trans people, are all anti-normative and interdisciplinary and looking for other ways to be in the world. As Elias has noted, I quote, Halberstam collects a set of narratives that weave together a politics of solidarity, of refusal, of unbecoming and unknowing, of the absurd, that all come back to failing differently, failing better, and failing collectively. In a way then, failure becomes a way to succeed, because if you fail to uphold dominant forms, forms that valorize violence, it is a way to win. Perhaps also to add that in the panel discussion with Ukwanda called What is a Joint, there too, I was struck by how Spogazi, Luya, Sipo, and Donna embrace failure as part of their methodology in puppet creation. It was striking how it is weaved in so uncontroversially into their practice. The Quiet Violence of Dreams is a novel that is set in Cape Town and follows the life of a young South African man called Tsepo as he navigates post-apartheid South Africa. It is a book that explores the social geographies of Cape Town, a city that remains plagued by apartheid spatial and social geographies, which has been uttered over and over again here. In the novel, the protagonist, Tsepo, explores his sexuality as he navigates the city, an environment littered with complex intersections of race, class, and gender. Here, I am interested in the complicated and sometimes contradictory role the urban, post-colonial African city plays in the activation and continuous construction of queer identities. Here I'm thinking along Fabian that, I quote, to come into one's queerness is a continuous cycle of destruction, grief, and rebuilding. To accept one's own queerness is often to destroy one's preconceived notions about gender and sexuality, to unsettle deeply set cultural norms about identity. Again, themes that have been coming up in some of our conversations, particularly also in the second last panel, if I can call it that, about Xhosa male identities. Okay. The character of Tsepo goes through a process of self-discovery as they navigate young adult life post-university graduation, trying to figure out who they are and what they want to do with their life. As the book progresses, we discover pivotal things about Tsepo that have shaped his life, part of which is the death of his mother in a spectacularly violent manner in his presence. We also discover that he has a very difficult relationship with his father. We are also privy to his relationship to drugs, particularly the use of cannabis, and how his use of this drug triggers mental health issues in the form of what in the book is termed cannabis-induced psychosis. These are just some of the many threads in the book that one can follow and write about. Here I am interested in the ways that the city of Cape Town is an important feature in the ways that Tsepo goes through the city and goes through the process of self-discovery, and how the character's sexual identity is constituted. In the book, The City of Cape Town, with its beauty, historical racial segregation, its port-side city-induced sexual diversity history, and its slow and stubborn transformation in the post-apartheid moment figures large in the post-colonial moment. In some ways, the city is one of the characters in the novel. As the book progresses, we get to see how each character that is important to the story sees the protagonist and how they relate to him. This enables the reader to see the different ways the characters interpret the same situation, and how, like in lived reality, people experience the same situation, the same occasion, from different points of view, affected by their own prejudices, their own desires, and their own life experiences. These different characters in themselves are worthy of attention and elaboration as they reveal all kinds of what Nuttall calls entanglements. Entanglements can be described as a condition of being twisted together and entwined, involved with. It speaks of an intimacy gained, even if it was resisted or ignored or uninvited. It is a term which may gesture towards a relationship or a set of relationships that is complicated and snaring in a tangle, but which also implies a human foldedness. It works with difference and sameness, but also with their limits. Illustrating the condition of being South African in the post-apartheid moment, and this foldedness that Nuttall talks about is revealed and plays out in the lives of the characters in The Quiet Violence of Dreams. Through the character of Tsepo, Dacre sketches out the experiences of a young man wrestling with what it means to grow up in a post-colony in post-apartheid South Africa, in a city. The entanglements show themselves throughout the novel, but they perhaps come to life more poignantly as Tsepo, who eventually finds a job in a male massage parlor that includes the selling of sex, where he befriends and is intimate with one of the white guys he works with, called West. In their interaction, Tsepo develops feelings for West and starts daydreaming about him. But this daydreaming unsettles him as he ponders about its meaning, particularly in interracial terms. His thought process goes like this. I spend the evening thinking about West, thinking about my life, wondering about all the things that have influenced me. What do they mean? Is it possible to draw sincere meaning from all the things that I have known from Black and white culture? Is it possible to feel South African? Underline that. Is it possible to feel South African? Feel like I can draw inspiration from white South Africans, that I can identify with them? Is it possible to feel South African and not to always source my culture to a particular race group? Can I claim Afrikaans, colored tsotsitaal, Indian cuisine, English sensibilities as my own? Now, we don't have time to, because there's lots more other things I'm interested to unearthing here, but we could take each of those and kind of and speak to them. And also, I mean, we've had conversations about the Afrikaans language, particularly Lindelwa and Lee and I, about how it articulates itself here, how it articulates itself in the Eastern Cape, and the different ways in which people come to the language. But there are many other things. I mean, I think also we could thread some of the conversations we've had with Soleto about, I raised an interesting point about what, Xhosa men coming from the bush wear when they come back, right? Which has a kind of a certain sartorial sensibility, which can be linked to the ways in which, British English kind of gentleman wears. And so there are lots of things we can talk about there. But this passage captures, for me, the post-apartheid South African angst of living in a transforming society that is still recovering from the violent past, of legalized racial segregation. The passage captures, of course, entanglement, ensnarement, and foldedness as young South Africans make sense of the not so distant racial past that still shapes our lives, as they imagine and desire futures that might be different from the ones of their parents. The question posed by Tsepo, is it possible to feel South African, is striking, as it is loaded with many other questions, like what is it to be South African? What makes one a South African? Again, I think, Lindo Kushle, there were things you touched upon here in the questioning when you were asking about the train and xenophobia, march to march. We can link those in there. In an attempt to think the character of Tsepo, and again, an attempt, I'm trying to tease out why this book has remained an important piece of writing in the South African literary canon. I've had this conversation with some of you. And part of it, I think, the book opens up questions about identity, about belonging, transformation, self-discovery, and living on the edge, liminal, right? Not yet. Often, queer and gender diverse identities are clouded with obscurity and incomprehensibility. Comes back to the question about the Constitution, Lindo, again. Many queer and gender diverse people experience or articulate a sense of in-betweenness. These identities often don't have a permanent place in the current structures of society. So what happens is that they must imagine radical presence and futures. Hence, I think there is a special relationship between speculative fiction and queer theory. In speculative fiction and queer theory, Wendy Gay Pearson argues that, I quote, speculative fiction is a powerful medium for both queer readers and queer writers because it empowers narratives, characters, and or settings that disrupt the many ways in which dominant assumptions about race, gender, and sexuality are produced, and in turn reinforce colonial aspirations and expectations. Keeping this in mind, granted, this is not a speculative fiction book, I wanted to kind of slot that in there. Tsepo's journey leads him to work as a sex worker at a male massage parlor in the gay district, quote unquote. It is during his stint as a sex worker that Tsepo discovers himself. This is where he explores his own sexuality and how to be somewhat comfortable with that sexuality. Through working at the underground escort agency, he learns about people and their different journeys through interacting with them, both as co-workers and as clients. Tsepo's journey as he meanders in the world of selling sex to other men in the gay district of Cape Town conjures up Western's articulations that, I quote, gender is about race, is about class, is about sexuality, is about age, is about nationality, is about an entire range of social relations, pointing to the importance of understanding one's social positioning as an amalgamation of these social categories and social positions. In The Quiet Violence of Dreams, Dacre sketches out how these categories manifest in their complexity in the lives of young South Africans in the post-apartheid era. What we get to see through this work is the ways in which the words of Bao, I quote, are situated here. Desires are far from spontaneous. They are constantly being conditioned, disciplined, and commodified under different regimes of governance. Close quote. Indeed, sex and sexuality are far from natural. They are manifestations, to use Foucault, of a body totally imprinted by history and the process of history's destruction of that very body. One of the things that makes this book an important contribution to South African literature is this audacity to center not only sex, but sexuality, particularly, of course, same-sex desire. While sexual orientation is protected in the Constitution of South Africa, there remains discrimination, prejudice, and violence towards people who are gender diverse, diverse in sexual orientation, who might belong to, the alphabet soup, LGBTQI, etc., and queer communities. So the publication of this book was an incredibly powerful moment of asserting queerness, particularly of the Black kind, not only in the city and its peripheries, but also in the literary imagination sphere of South Africa. Scholars like Tucker, in Queer Visibilities, I'm kind of switching gears a little bit here. Scholars like Tucker in Queer Visibilities and the work of Elaine Salo, may she rest in peace, made visible queerness outside of Cape Town city center and highlighted how race, space, and sexuality intersect with very, 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 very complicated results. Tucker demonstrates how gay people of color have to navigate often unwelcoming, predominantly white gay spaces in the city center, a phenomenon that has also been observed and documented by Matabene in the ways that Black lesbians are not fully represented even within LGBTQI politics and often exist in the periphery even as they participate and are part of queer movement building, underline. In thinking with Elaine Salo, who actually taught me anthropology in honors, and affected how I think about gender and sexuality in township spaces in the post-apartheid moment. So now I can't help but think of the work of Darian Thorne Adams, who is a who how does he describe himself? Who is a multi-hyphenate dance artist, close quote, who was born and raised in Menenberg, one of the townships in the Cape Flats that is fortunately synonymous with high rates of gang violence. Crucially, Adams is also the founder of the AIM Society, a community-based initiative which, with often very, very little way of resources, pushes against the trope of Menenberg as only a place of crime and violence. And Menenberg came up, was it yesterday or the day before, with Valmont as well. I want to play this. Thanks. I can't remember what time I started, but.
story begins. Home is the starting place of love, hope, and dreams. The magic thing about home is that it feels good to leave, and it feels better to come back. Home is where our love resides, memories are created, friends always belong, and laughter never ends.
Adams made a decision not to leave Menenberg and decided rather to make life livable in Menenberg, asserting, "So then I saw the power of being here. I realized that everything that I want is at home. My mom is here, my family is here, I'm at peace here, even though there is violence, even though there is crime, even though there isn't, even though it isn't polished. My whole upbringing is here," close quote. Adams articulates his queerness and Menenbergness as his superpowers. Adams engages in the politics of staying, which in many ways is antithetical to the normative gay story, which is scripted as leaving the small town, leaving the ghetto, leaving the rural area in pursuit of a better life in the city. And as many of you know, or maybe some of you, maybe 5% of you, this idea of leaving is captured, of course, in what I suppose becomes a kind of gay discourse through gay popular music or music that is termed, gay anthems, right? That speak to this idea of finding a better life elsewhere because of, obvious reasons, and is obviously captured in the, ideas of going to the big metropolitan area. And the difficult relationship, of course, with living and staying. And I bring this, so this is the one area of this is very, very well thought, where I'm thinking through it, because Cape Town sits in a very complicated position in terms of, the metropole, right? As we think about it in terms of, it likes to think of itself as, a Sydney or a London or, a San Francisco, which of course it is not, right? It has, but the kind of queer politics from those places are kind of imprinted in the ways in which the city figures itself. And so the idea of going west, right, which is captured in the songs like Going West from the Village People, and then the Pet Shop Boys, which of course speak to, the idea of leaving the city to go living, the rural, and to go into the city, which then, narrativize, right, creates a grammar for the queer experience. And so, as I said, some of you will know the songs from the 1979 disco track of Go West by the Village People, which actually, which speaks particularly to California and San Francisco specifically. So there's, there are racial undertones here that one could get into as well. But I think I find the 1990s Pet Shop Boys song also quite interesting because, of course, it takes on a somber and emotional and bittersweet kind of, synth pop vibe. Because, of course, the HIV/AIDS pandemic is ravaging through the community at that time. This Go West ethos is also obviously captured in George Michael's Flawless, Go to the City, which I actually do enjoy. And I wondered about this actually from the conversation before. I'm going off script a bit now, because there is here too the song about leaving right? The rural or leaving home and going to the city. Lots of songs about Johannesburg like that. I didn't really know how to imprint them on here, but I was just putting that out there. But as I said, Adams does not embrace this narrative. Staying is important for him because Menenberg is important to him, and his artistic intervention is deeply tied to Menenberg as a site that wants to say something. C. Sparks writes that while the Go West philosophy measures success about how far you have gone, right? Adam offers us a different story, one where success is not measured by escape, one where the act of staying becomes its own form of resistance. Through their artistic interventions that are located in Menenberg, Adams rejects the idea of Menenberg as only a site of violence and social crisis, but one where beauty and art can be alive. So the idea of staying, which for me is another version of embracing failure, if success is measured by escape. Staying has been a structure or a plot of a number of novels, some of which I have become absolutely obsessed with. Two recent, well, the other one not so recent, the other one's not so recent. The recent novel by Ocean Vuong, of course, The Emperor of Gladness. He writes against the idea of going west, as it were, and asks what happens to those who stay. For many, many complicated reasons, of course. Another set of novels, which I'm just kind of pushing you through because I'm thinking with this idea of staying, and I don't know where I'm going to go with it. But another set of novels that I was really, really obsessed with is the Neapolitan novels, which are a 4-part series of fiction by the Italian author Elena Ferrante, translated into English between 2012 and 2015, which deal with the liminal space, I like to call, that is created between two friends, the one who leaves and the one who stays. And I wondered also, I mean, maybe I'm reaching here, Nosipo, but I wondered what relationship does waiting have to staying? Maybe nothing. Quiet Violence of Dreams, as you can see, by the way I tie the book to so much, maybe too much, I see the publication of this book with immense political importance and the representation of the lives contained within this book as a pivotal moment for South African literature, particularly for young people at the time. You know who was young then. In the book, there is a section where Tsepo is in conversation with one of the men that work at the massage parlor with him, Sebastian. The conversation is about sexuality, culture, and history. The conversation reflects many conversations that have taken place in South Africa in the post-apartheid dispensation, where there is a wrestling with ideologies about traditional ideas of gender and sexuality and progressive ideas built on the 1994 Constitution. In the conversation, what is traditional and what is progressive is under scrutiny as colonialism is also taken into account. Men really haven't been given the chance to explore their sexuality. Men are either married or expected to be. There is no in between. So men haven't explored the possibilities of being men. There is no place for them. In so-called primitive societies, men are more aware of themselves. I'm not talking about status or power. I'm talking about self-awareness. Perhaps it is true that so-called primitive people are more sexual. I would be. It sounds more natural. The thing about Western culture is that it sanitizes sex and horniness and politeness and manners, but in a rigid form. Here, Dacre is wrestling with gender, particularly masculinity, which has come up in there. Maybe we have a project, no? as it relates to sexuality and often the caging of masculinity in contemporary society. There is an engagement here with the ways that dominant masculinity functions as a disciplinary tool for all men, requiring them to limit their expressions and desires. Men often have a fear of being read as feminine and thereby read as weak. This results in them overcompensating with masculine bravado to distance themselves from any accusations of being like a girl. What is striking in the monologue is the value placed on the importance of exploration and the possibilities contained for men in exploration. In this writing, the lack of exploration, which is therefore loss of self-discovery, which makes for a more fulfilling life, is attributed to colonization, because Western culture sanitizes sex and horniness and with politeness and manners. This is a provocation that is inviting us to think about decoloniality beyond race and nationality. I know that term. But to also seriously address the complicated ways that colonialism has affected our ideas of gender and sexuality. I write quite a bit about this. In this, we are challenged to think about the limits placed on men in their masculinity by Western-informed gender binary and the dogmatic hetero-homo dualism. If we are to take seriously what Dacre calls primitive societies / people and how they are freer with their sexuality, we perhaps arrive at a different idea of what sexuality is, particularly same-sex desire. It should be clear then that I am reading primitive society and people as perhaps indigenous ways of knowing. The question then becomes, how does sexuality for men look like if we take seriously how it is articulated in non-Western locations and histories, taking into account how sex and sexuality in colonial modernity, particularly as it pertains to the colonized subject, was negatively constructed by colonialists. As Vaughan has reflected that, I quote, in colonial societies, lines were drawn on the basis of class and sexuality, as well as on the basis of race, so that each member of the society, colonizer or colonized, was located somewhere in the complex colonial social matrix. Studies of gender and sexuality in colonial Africa and India indicate how unstable and insecure many of these boundaries were, and their very instability giving rise to the anxiety which insisted on fixicity. It was the very complexity of social change in colonial society which gave rise to attempts to rigidity and simplicity. Relatedly, gender scholars like Morel and Lindinger, focusing on masculinities on the African continent, have emphasized the need for specificity when it comes to local realities and articulations of masculinities, and moving away from universalized masculinities, which tend to focus, of course, Euro-American. Ratele argues for a situated psychology. Psychologies, where am I? Yes, so Ratele, who advocates for situated studies in African psychology that place at the center of their inquiry local realities, he argues that situated psychologies are perhaps above anything not alienating. It is a psychology that is conscious of African people not as appendages to others, but as living meaningful lives in and of themselves. A great example, perhaps, of this different register is the situatedness in the work of Guadio that illustrates the diversity of masculinities in a complex context where they center the lives of Yandaudu men described as feminine men in the northern region of Nigeria, which is on the screen now. and Dadu men are classified as men who act like women in their local context, not to be mistaken with gay in the global sense of the term, but effeminate men who are part of the local culture and figure in the local ecosystem. Here, then, we are pressed to reconsider the gender and sexuality categories that we have inherited through colonialism, because in this particular case, local indigenous articulations of gender and sexualities inhabit an outside of what has become, even now, in the post-colonial normative genders and sexualities. Elsewhere in the novel, after a sexual encounter with a paying customer, he calls this paying customer the cowboy. Tsepo has sexual revelations and revelations about his body. This is his thought process after the cowboy has left. The world can send me to hell if it wants. I would go if my cowboy was there. Quietly, I have held my body a prisoner. I put limits on my body, cordoned off a certain part of me. I starved myself of the curiosity of discovery. Every time they asked me if I was versatile, I said no. I have done that. No thanks. I don't think that's right, but okay. I cried in my thoughts. Love hurts. The truth is, it takes courage to love a man, to sleep with him. That is all there is to it. It has nothing to do with sordid pictures that people imagine when they think of two men having sex. Gay men are as clean as other people, and anal sex is nothing new. It is not even a gay invention. Touché. So why the uproar about it? Why shouldn't two men show each other love the way they want? Who is anyone to judge the same impulses that govern all of us? Perhaps just to say on this piece, it's interesting some of what comes up here, because it's making me think of another thing. I mean, I've shared this, I think, with some of you about. I've been thinking with Foucault's friendship as a way of life, where he talks about friendship, particularly friendship between men, and how to think about how perhaps same-sex desire reorientates us in terms of relationality. And some of this actually reminded me of that now. I didn't think about that before, but anyway. Similarly to the passage before, where there was a desire for exploration and possibility, but spoken in a more theoretical sense, in this passage, again through the protagonist, Tsepo, Deka moves from the theoretical into the material, the body. Here, the black body is brought to the center. Tsepo describes his body as a prisoner, that he places limits on it, that certain parts of him were cordoned and shoved off curiosity of discovery. This section recalls the long history of the subjugation of the black body. It is speaking to the multiple ways that black people, black men in this instance, become a prisoner of the bodies because of the long durée of the negative interpretation via Mbembe of black bodies throughout colonial history. Indeed, Stuart Hall argues that in racialized discourse, the black male body functions as a terminal signifier, racism's ground zero. Trapped in fantasies of tribal and urban violence, immured in an exorbitant and pathological sexuality, petrified in nature as flies in amber, close quote. This negative interpretation, where the black male body is racism's ground zero, is made that much more complicated by gay men's identities and their sexual desires. Therefore, Tsepo is coming to terms with the world he has been socialized into, where he has been taught to reject himself and his desires, where he has had to hurt himself in order to be recognizable in the world of man, as a man. In this, then, I am pressed to remember the incisive words of Hooks, that's Bell for you, that, I quote, The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves in an individual. If an individual is not successful in emotional crippling themselves, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem, close quote. Therefore, Tsepo illustrates the multiple ways that he has engaged in acts of psychic self-mutilation, killing off parts of himself. This writing is linked to the first passage as both sections are grappling. So by first, I meant the one before this one. This writing is linked to the first passage as both sections are grappling with the ways men, particularly black men, need to recuperate from colonially informed masculinity formulations that imprison them in all kinds of complicated ways, including, of course, an aversion to same-sex desire. It is clever of Dacre to center Tsepo's articulation of freedom after he has had consensual receptive anal sex for the first time. Throughout his time as someone selling sex, Tsepo refused to engage in this. In this encounter with the cowboy, he finally engages it with another man, and this is followed by revelations contained in this passage. Here, Dacre deliberately is linking liberation with same-sex desire. In other words, only when Tsepo truly opens himself up, I mean, literally, to his full queerness does he experience true freedom. Dacre is showing us the power of queerness, but also the power of leaning into your freedom, even as the traditional world disagrees. Queerness has the power to transform us as individuals and those around us and the institutions with which we engage. Here, of course, I'm using queerness in the Halperin sense, where queerness is an identity without an essence, not a given condition, but a horizon of possibility. Queerness seeks to move away from the carceral nature of identity and embraces fluidity, movement, expansion, becoming. Foundationally, queer, then, demarcates not a positivity, but a positionality, vis-a-vis the normative, a positionality that is not restricted to lesbians and gay men, but is in fact available to anyone who is or feels marginalized because of his or her sexual practices, which also is such a limiting language, but here we are. It could include some married couples without children, for example, or even, who knows, some married couples with children. Let's not exclude anyone. With perhaps very naughty children. This formulation is expansive in terms of what could possibly constitute something as queer, making divergence and distance from the normal the pertinent requirement of queerness. Therefore, Tsepo embraces the queerness in him, his desire for other men, that which makes him different, that which requires courage, that which could possibly get him rejected, but also that which brings him immense pleasure and freedom. Now the question is, do I continue or should we stop? Do we have more time? I think people probably want to drink. I have a whole other section on race in the city, but maybe I'm sending feelers out. Yes. Fabulous. So I will skip then all of this, because, I mean, one can write, I mean, whether it's good or not is up in the air, but perhaps then to close, right? So I've broken this into the queer in the city and then race in the city. So there's obviously all kinds of other things that come from that, but time. In this piece, and I did shift, because in the original paper, the other one is after, but I wanted to concentrate on the queer aspect. But anyway, enough of my whatever. In this piece, I'm thinking through the quiet violence of dreams, as obviously you can hear, wondering what happens when cityness, literariness, and quiet and queerness comes into view. What does the exploration of queerness in a post-apartheid city, in the post-colony, through the literary give us? Here I want to channel Bao in queering the global South, in echoing the performative and the transformative power of writing. Because, I quote, language is not simply descriptive. It does not merely represent reality. Rather, it is performative in that it brings social realities and identities into existence. This is a point that was made a bit by Jack earlier on as well. One of the biggest triumphs of this book is the engagement in the critique of the disarticulation of race from sexuality. Dacre creates a cityscape that not only illuminates where diverse sexualities exist, but creates a world where the diverse sexualities that can manifest and also can be constituted. Furthermore, Dacre is engaged in a serious question of what it means to be South African in the post-apartheid moment, as the country wrestles with post-apartheid democracy. What does it mean to be free? And how does one practice that freedom? Through the character of Tsepo, Dacre is unpacking the triumphs of post-1994 SA with regards to social identities, but also, crucially, the disappointments of the post-apartheid moment to live up to its democratic promise of freedom for all. This thinking is captured in one of the many monologues of Tsepo that he has in his head. So there's a whole thing I have there about, this cannabis-induced psychosis and madness and Fanon, but, another day. This monologue goes, will whites ever really hear us? And will we blacks always be on the defensive? Is it possible to be comfortable with each other as we are, not wanting to alter each other? Dacre's work should be seen as a necessary and pivotal work that demands that we think of what it means to live in a transforming society, and then how we want to position ourselves for the imagined South African future. His considerations on race and racial interactions in the ways young Black South Africans experience them are almost a premonition of the eruption that became Must Fall. Movements. Towards the end of the book, the protagonist, Tsepo, says, I quote, "Perhaps I sense that I will die young. Death is begging at my heels in my dreams," close quote. This is poignant on a number of levels, but chiefly because K. Sello Dacre, the author of this book, died by suicide in 2005. This book was published in 2001. And so his real death is almost prophesied in the book. In that sense, I can't help but agree with the Simphiwe Mahala, who describes Dacre by saying, and I quote, "Dacre is to literature what Steve Biko was to politics. Both have died at the tender age of 30, but leaving indelible footprints in our collective memory," close quote. Both Dacre and Biko left us with incredible writing that not only yearn for liberation and a different future South Africa, but they etched out roadmaps for possibility for all of us. Thank you.
I feel like your conversation was in conversation with a lot of things that we've been talking about. I want to call attention back to Denise Walsh's paper on politicized misogyny, in the sense that bell hooks, right? Her argument is that misogyny hurts all of us, right? It's not just women, right? And so I wonder, just an invitation to Denise to maybe think about something as a conversational piece. Definitely to Sibulela and to Soleto, who you also mentioned, right? That there's these classificatory codes that, that really do not allow for the in-between, right? And then I want to invite you to expand a little bit about urban identity because you couldn't get to that part. And I want to think a little bit with you about the distinction, that Ferdinand Tönnies, the sociologist, makes between Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, and the idea of creating a family of choice, right? And what the city affords. And I'm thinking a little bit of Armistead Maupin's Tales from the City, if you remember that. I mean, that was like a big thing, right? So I feel like that's kind of a nice parallel.
I guess when there's dance, I'm gonna have a question. Um, I'm interested in the comparison between the two characters that you kind of spoke about, which was Selo and Darian. So with Selo, he's speaking about how he puts limits on his body, cordoned off a certain part of him, and starved himself of the curiosity of discovery, right? And then you also spoke about these dreams, these dreams, which for me seems like it's movement in stillness, because dreams are something, whether you're daydreaming or sleeping, it's something that happens when you're still, and you really have to like explore the mind and move with it. And then the thoughts that came up for me was like, Darian is staying in a position but moving in a very specific way. So the things that came up for me was like this staying and stillness, and staying and movement, and then leaving and stillness, and leaving and movement. And what do those like do to each other? And at which point do we then have that self-awareness, which is also what I speak about in my work on dance, and then using dance to help with self-awareness. But then he spoke about self-awareness, like when does that happen? He spoke about it in primitive societies when men are more self-aware. But like, so yeah, I just wanted to put that on the table of the stillness movement, leaving and stillness, because making the decision to leave also still puts you in a position where you have to think whether I'm leaving to escape and be still, or am I leaving to still move?
And my question also has to do with staying and leaving and the work of the literary, right? And your sense of literature and the literary as performative, and I've always really liked Cesare Casarino's sense of the literary as the literary as the work of reading itself, right? At what he calls the edge of a text's perfection. And you reminded me of two much older novels. The one by, and I don't know if I pronounce his name properly, but Oluguem, Bound to Violence, and then Sheikh Hamidou Khan's Ambiguous Adventure, both of which trace this problem of leaving and coming back, and also, but part of that is other people who have left and come back, which is Europeans colonizing Africa, right? And that kind of intersection between those two, and then what does it mean when you invent new identities or old identities and give them new names in the midst of all of that? And they both explore how every reified form basically kills you. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you're, if it's from an African indigenous side or from a European, or etc. So, but the point, I guess, is the work of the literary in that, as a mode of reading that, but also creating space. It's that utopia that Andres was talking about. Yeah. So just I guess it's more of a prompt than a question, though.
Thank you, Lwando. You've suddenly started connecting dots for me that I've been sitting with. And so I'm going to gloss over a few things that resonate for me, that are coming out of your work, your reflection on the work, and a few other things. It's about the question of queerness and the archive in my work around jazz and the slave memory. One of the connections you made now was around Manenberg and the question of leaving and staying. And Premesh, I think, raised this famous quote of Abdullah Ibrahim Jalak, you can go to New York, but I'm going to stay here in Manenberg. And there's something that also connects for me with what I was speaking about around Darkom di Alabama and Welcome to Cape Town. There's a kind of positioning, and it's from Habiba Badroun's work, where she speaks about, she's speaking about the picturesque in landscape art, in 19th century colonial art, in depictions of Cape Town, and she's looking at Cape Town from Signal Inn. But this is all to say that there's this trope in which Cape Town is depicted as a place of waiting, always looking to elsewhere. And I wonder if, in what your, I guess what your work is suggesting is that there's a emerging vocabulary for me about how I might think about the queer and the queering of the archive. There are other things I can go into. There's another thing that I've been sitting with, how to find an ethics to speak about memory, is hundreds of stories of cross-dressing in the carnival in Cape Town in 40, 50, 60, 80 years ago. Something that is very difficult to have public conversations about, but we're not going to have a healthy conversation about slave memory and carnival and the connection to jazz without it. I think also of there are artists like Terence Trent D'Arby who speaks at one point in his own a kind of emotional crisis about the feminizing of black men in the music industry, and he points to Michael Jackson. But I wonder if I could point to, not necessarily in the same analogous way, what is happening with Yakal Nkomo and the life of Winston Mankunku and the life cycle of that work. Because so yeah, I can go on, but I just want to say thank you for I guess opening up ways of developing a vocabulary to think about these things, and where the kind of the cutoff points or the points of frustration have been for me.
The first thing that came up for me was this idea of desire and the desire for belonging, and I was thinking around like how we might kind of desexualize that, particularly looking at how kind of history brings about the destruction of this body, and that body, including Manenberg as a kind of product of destruction, and then in years and easy immersed in a violence that is not always quiet. Yeah. So I was wondering about, so in this idea of like desexualizing it, for me it's very interesting when the dancer mentions, I'm staying because my mom is here, you know, which made me think about my kind of rattling off at the housing assembly meeting recently in Mowbray. And I asked the question about why is it that single women aren't being accommodated in plans for social housing, which kind of drew attention to the kind of ideological edifice that social housing is built on. So I was wondering, how might we kind of historicize this capacity to stay, you know? What does it mean for the dancer's sister, you know, in that particular context? And I'm saying this on the basis of Cape Town as a city was it was built by the men of the city, you know. Whether those men came from Elam or the Transkei, these were the men that kind of built the city, whereas mothers built the home. So with having built that home, we find that there are these queer roots in a city of no belonging. And I'm just wondering how that kind of sensibility of not belonging finds transposition inside the home, inside the city, and on the street, which is under siege. Yeah, so I don't know what I'm asking there necessarily, but for me it was very interesting how a queer, somebody who identifies as queer, is this phenomenal dancer. Yeah, I'm interested in the kind of texture of the space of that violence, of the desire then to remain in that violence as a breath of air. But nonetheless, what is it about him that he's able to do this? You know?
And I told you earlier that I was going to leave midway, but I just couldn't. So thank you so much. So just maybe these are not so much as questions as things to also put on the table, but a slight detour to begin. Habiba Badaroun, who's also been mentioned already, her most recent poetry collection, A History of Intimacy, I think came out in 2019 or 2020. But there's a poem in there titled Surface, which is, and the speaker in the poem is sort of as a young Muslim woman in the early 90s arriving at the University of Cape Town. And they're just talking amongst themselves. And the speaker in the poem, towards the end, she says, she confides to the reader that I loved the skin of white boys. And I think it's such like a transgressive statement. I just wanted to put it there for you. And then just some other things about then Selodeka, like what happens to Quiet Violence of Dreams if you also read it with 13 Cents. That's the book that comes before, right? Like, and what happens to that? And then the other thing I was also thinking about is what also happens if we read Selodeka as Quiet Violence of Dreams and 13 Cents as Cape Town novels, right? Like there's also Alex Laguma, all of these things, but as Cape Town novels, like what happens there? And then maybe just two other things is I was also thinking about like what happens also in terms with the literariness if we place K. Selodeka next to somebody also, because the temptation is always to place Selodeka with Paswane Mpe, Welcome to Ahilbro. But what if you do something else entirely, which is to place K. Selodeka with somebody like even Koos Prinsloo, an Afrikaans writer. I think he dies in the early 90s, right? And what does that do to both? And then maybe the final thing is that autofiction is a term I think that comes much later. But I wonder also if this is not something that we can also bring to K. Selodeka's, those two novels, because the third one comes posthumously. But anyway, just things to put there on the table and to say thank you.
Particularly thinking of the work of the body within this text and looking at the body as an act of refusal of the limits that is offered to them, particularly given the queer body, but then also thinking of the limits of that refusal and thinking of it through this, like the position of the massage parlor within Cape Town and how it itself can offer space for refusal and inserting itself in a space where it doesn't belong. But then also there's limits to it, thinking of the the way in which capital is involved there in the transaction between the black body and the white body, specifically when you think of cowboy. And then that's like one part of my comment or something I want to put on the table. And then also I'm also going to throw back that relationship between waiting and staying. And I want to think of it as different weights of waiting. And the question now lies is which weighs more? And what mechanisms do we use? And I'm tentatively thinking of the ideas of hope and nostalgia as means in which we engage with these different weights of waiting.
I just wanted to maybe push back on something and maybe just give something to think about. I think it is potentially dangerous to sort of put men as part of being victims of misogyny, because I feel like that is a bit of a slippery slope where people only start caring about misogyny and how it affects women when it affects men too. Just something to think about.
I particularly wanted to comment on your ideas about heterosexuality as the loss of self-discovery. And that's something that really resonates with me. And I think, and also your idea of it's available to anyone, which, you know, I think is very resonant at the moment. As I don't know if you've paid attention to the conversation about the tragedy of heterosexuality. It's been very, it's resonated with a lot of straight people. Like, we want less dismal relationships. so I'm just excited that I'm excited about the idea of drawing people and alluring people, and that I suppose it is adjacent to Mark Fisher's idea of asset communism, which is just making the left joyous again. So I'm just, I like the idea of just the allure of queerness, and you know, as someone who's only like reluctantly heterosexual, I like, yeah, I like the idea of drawing people in, and I wonder if it strategically sometimes makes sense.
First of all, I don't know how to answer any of these questions. Thank you so much, everybody, for indulging me. I mean, as I said, I'm thinking through many of these things, and you know, I had read the book, and then I had to go back and I had to read it again. I had read it, you know, then, and then I was like, well, let me go to my and bring it back, and of course, then you begin to see new things. And then, as I was preparing for this. And so when that thing comes back, it feels like it's gonna be a new paper, because already, and thank you for your comments, because I'll probably be using them to think with and to think through, and so thanks. And I mean, I'm not being a coy when I say I'm not sure I know how to answer any of these questions, but I will attempt. And since, you know, failure is my middle name, you know, you know, it is going to the book at the second time, actually, and it is the work of Adams that that animates staying as a kind of thing to think with and to think about. And you know, when one thing lands, and then you start to remember so many of the other things that you read that connect to, and I mean, our conversation, Jack, about, and I'm answering you here like this, and then I'll go to the other ones. And part of the problematic I'm having, of course, is I'm struggling with, you know, I'm thinking through the idea of the city, because of course the city figures very large in the gay identity, right? In the ways in which also, you know, gay lives are narrated in the popular, right? And so and of course myself too, coming into my own, you know, the city is the ideal. The city is where one aims to go to not only find oneself and constitute yourself, because, you know, you look around you and you think, you know, you're fucked. So my engagement is not, you know, you know, I love the city in that sense. And so although one can come at a critical angle to it, particularly vis-a-vis how the city gets narrated when you think about, you know, other places. And I do think that Cape Town particularly, and you're right, I'm not gonna answer you in order, but you're right, I don't even know their names anymore. About Cape Town, and I think this is a Cape Town novel, exactly as you say, and 13 Cents is a Cape Town novel. It's funny because there are scenes I thought about in this book, and I don't know if I could write about. I find 13. I mean, I read it and I find it very hard. I find 13 Cents very, very difficult. Though I've read it, you know, and I don't know if I could write about 13 Cents. And I mean, maybe one day, I don't know. And so I get the what you're getting to. And you know, with all of its, and this is the other thing, I think, with all of its troubles, Cape Town, I'm still on, you know, it is also an incredibly seductive city, right? With all kinds of permissions and that enable ways to be, right? That, you know, live alongside, you know, collide with, you know, so many other lives and so many other ways in which people constitute who they are, etc. And I mean, the idea of course, Prinsloo is, I never thought about that. But I think perhaps there's something there actually to think across. And it sounds like I need to read The History of Intimacy, because I haven't read that. So thank you. And then, there was the question of, Moritz, and I think also Jack, and and the idea of developing a vocabulary was also thrown out. And I think, when Jack was reading my biography, well, I don't know, introducing me, not reading my biography. You know, yes, the poem that which I really love, right, by Fahida, which is called "Let's Create a New Lexicon," right? And it's an amazing poem, and I really lean on it in terms of thinking about this. And so I'm very happy that people can find. Particularly now, I'm responding to you, Valmont, right? In terms of to develop a language, because part of the problem, and as you can see, perhaps as I'm presenting, part of the problem is the limit of language, right? I run against the limit of language in terms of how do you describe things, and how do you because in some ways you're trying to reach beyond what the language is giving you, and and there's a threshold there, there's a limit, there's a way in which I can't get beyond. When you think about the terms, even homo hetero you're locked in, right? Even though homo is trying to say there's this whole other sphere of people, there's still a kind of duality there. And that's just one, of course, and so I think us having this conversation here and thinking about Menenberg and thinking about Cape Town, because of course, as I said, Cape Town, it sits so difficult with not only its own peripheries, right? It sits also difficult with the Eastern Cape, right? It sits in a very difficult relationship with the places that some of the politicians of the city will call people who come from those places refugees, which is which again, much to march. I wonder who's marching, right? So there's an interesting or difficult relationship, not interesting, a difficult relationship that I think the city has with its peripheries, which gets animated, or which comes through the ways in which our identities are shaped, are constituted, and the ways, of course, in which we move in the city, and the ways maybe we don't move, right? And then, the question of staying or leaving, I'm also really playing with this, and I don't know I'm in the kind of beginnings of it, but I'm really excited because it's funny also. It's only when I picked up, I read all the other, I read those, the Ferrante novels, and Emperor of Gladness, but it is only, it is what it activates. I come back to this. What activates it is, Menenbergness and the queerness that Adams puts together, which even as someone who is who's a queer scholar or queer theorist, I don't know, whatever, is thinking with these things and thinking through these things, the ways in which that constellation activated and then subsequently I went back to all of these other stay and leave kind of dichotomies, and so I started to wonder what is here, what is there, which of course resonates with me because I'm one of those who left, right? And so I must think more about staying and leaving, and I'm saying this also to try to come to the stillness, and Adams and the way in which Adams uses the body. That was the other thing that linked for me. This is also for you, Nosipo, in terms of thinking about the body. Throughout my education, there seemed to be a way in which there's enough, certainly in social science, maybe you all have been talking about the body, but the body is being almost elided. When I think about social science and I think about the ways in which, and perhaps maybe this is a question of, curriculum. I did go to some questionable universities, and so I've often felt the question of the body is not taken seriously in the ways in which my education has been curated, and I've been trying to think with the body, but there's always, and so this book enables a very, very concrete and very particular way, because Selo places the body at the center of the inquiry, and asks all kinds of questions. And of course, it is a very particular kind of body that is here. So coming back to stillness movement, I need to think more about this, but I see exactly what you're asking with, because he talks about staying, and he talks about being staying in Menenberg, and this is, it's a political thing, but it's also, I want to be with my family, I want to be with my and then proceeds to create life and ways and societies. He also does a movie screening in Menenberg, right? And so there's a serious politics around staying. It's not fleeting. It's wanting to be seriously rooted and embedded in and part of this, coming back to our conversation, is not to develop, but to think about the queer, because part of the problem, of course, is that queer theory travels a certain way, but I find it useful, even the one that travels, to think with, but to think about the queer from the global South is what I'm agitating for, and what Adam is doing is kind of clearing the bush, as it were. To think about these things. I don't know autofiction. I don't know what to say about that. I don't. Waiting and staying, different weights of waiting. Yes, I think so. I didn't even think about until you presented here. And then I was like, there could be something there, but what it is, I'm not really sure. But yes, perhaps it is a waiting. The staying and the waiting are differently weighted, right? In terms of what they are, and perhaps also what they do. And then the limits of the body. And I suppose this links to you, Lee, as your question about desire and belonging, and then why we might want to desexualize. This is a difficult question for me, right? I think because I'm always wondering. Not wondering, but is it a? I suppose perhaps maybe within the LGBTQ or sexuality studies, or LGBTQI lives or whatever, one might want to desexualize, but I often, why? Right? Why does sex make us nervous? Why does why does sex make us a bit like that? There's always an imperative to kind of tone down or to hide away or to, and for me, this I'm a bit. Can one say that, Foucauldian about this? I'm very ambivalent about the desire or the impulse for sex to be kind of I don't want to say hidden, but like because even even the question, should we or can we talk less or desexualize? We haven't even begun to sexualize, right? So the work that I do is itself on the fringe, right? It's not like a lot of people are clamoring to do this kind of work. So then in other words, I don't know how to answer you except how to answer you this way. But I feel, or I think I'm a bit ambivalent to move away from sex. Maybe other people can desexualize and I can remain sexualizing. And I fully get your point, and I think this is why sexualizing is important. Your point of why isn't single women are not accommodated, right, in the ways in which we think about. But this is exactly for me the work of queerness, right? It's the work of that the tyranny of the model of the heterosexual is the problem, right? The model of the two people, which of course now also the gays have kind of taken that on through the marriage regime, right? Of two people, cats, dogs, 2 children, 2.5. So part of the problem there is exactly that it forecloses other imaginative ways of constructing relationality, because we are sold the dream of, as my friend there put it, right, the tragedy of heterosexuality. All of us are sold that, right? Some of us just don't buy it, but very few of us don't. Okay, I think I should stop. But I'm sorry if I didn't answer you. We can talk. I mean, this is an open conversation, and I think that, as I said, there are many things that I could link up with many of the questions. And I take also very seriously the, part of the conversations that were in the panels with some of the researchers in the group that Jack has also mentioned. I think we have to think seriously about, the black body, the black male body, and culture, and the ways in which that also places limits and what it opens up, and I think, considering some of the things that came out of here, I mean, perhaps we are sitting on a workshop that particularly focuses on that kind of strand that might unearth things that we are thinking. How do you say it, Moritz? We're thinking about in common, but not whatever, that thing that you say. Thank you so much. I think we should end.
Thank you, Lwando. It's the end of winter school.